Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little heavier than usual. A story about war, but not the kind you've seen in movies or video games. I'm talking about the cold, harsh, and exhausting reality of a medieval battlefield. You see, we often imagine knights riding gloriously on horseback, banners flying, steel swords shining under the sun, and armies clashing with some kind of honor or chivalry. That's the picture books and films give us. But if you really found yourself transported back to the year 1350, standing on a battlefield in England, France, or anywhere across Europe, you wouldn't be riding a horse. You wouldn't be gallantly swinging a sword like a Hollywood hero. You'd be terrified, confused, and almost guaranteed not to survive the day. Tonight, we're going to slowly walk through what it would feel like to be there, and why you wouldn't last even a single battle. So, before we dive in, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift into the past together. Imagine opening your eyes in a damp canvas tent just before dawn. The ground under you isn't soft, it's a patch of cold, uneven earth covered with a thin straw mat. You didn't sleep well, because the night before, the camp was filled with noise. Men coughing, horses shifting in the mud, the clatter of armor being adjusted, and the occasional drunken shout. The smell is the first thing that hits you when you wake up. It's not the fresh air of nature. It's smoke from 100 campfires, mixed with manure, sweat, and rotting food scraps that nobody bothered to bury. Your throat feels dry, because there's no clean water. You might get a sip of stale ale or dirty water from a barrel if you're lucky. That's your breakfast, along with maybe a hunk of hard bread that feels like chewing wood. You pull yourself up, and the first thing you notice is your clothing. You're not in comfortable cotton or sportswear. You're wearing itchy, woolen garments that rub against your skin. If you're part of the Levi, which most ordinary men were, you've been given a padded cloth jacket called a gambeson. It's thick, heavy, and already smells of sweat and mildew. On top of that, if your lord has supplied it, there might be some chainmail or a rusty iron helmet. It's not fitted to your size, it was probably used by someone else before you, maybe even someone who didn't survive the last battle. It pinches at the neck, and the straps dig into your shoulders. You're already uncomfortable, and the sun isn't even up yet. The camp begins to stir as horns blow. It's not the kind of energizing trumpet sound you hear in war movies. It's a deep, rough blare that echoes across the foggy fields, telling you it's time to gather. Your stomach tightens, not just from hunger but from fear. You've heard stories about battles. The older soldiers, the veterans, talked around the fire last night. They said once the fighting starts, you won't hear commands clearly. You'll only hear screaming, metal crashing, and sometimes silence when the man next to you collapses. You try not to think about it, but your hands are already shaking as you pick up the wooden spear they gave you. It's long and awkward. It feels more like a farming tool than a weapon. And the truth is, for many men drafted into battle, that's exactly what it was, just a sharpened stick. As you walk out of the tent, the air is heavy. Dawn hasn't fully broken, but the mist rolls low across the grass. You see thousands of other men forming into lines. Some are peasants like you, barely armed, holding tools, clubs, or makeshift spears. Others are more professional soldiers, wearing partial plate armor or carrying crossbows. At the very front, mounted knights gather with their squires. They look intimidating, shining with steel, their banners fluttering. You might feel a little safer seeing them, but deep down, you know their job isn't to protect you. Their job is to charge at the enemy knights. You, standing here in your worn boots and carrying a wooden spear, are just another body to hold the line. The waiting is perhaps the worst part. Hours can pass before the battle truly begins. You stand there in formation, shoulder to shoulder with men who are just as nervous as you. Some try to make jokes. Some pray under their breath. Others vomit quietly in the grass, too scared to hide it. The commanders walk along the lines, shouting orders, trying to keep everyone steady. You're sweating even though the air is cold, because the padded armor traps heat. Your legs already ache from standing still so long. And every time you hear the distant sound of a horn or drum from the enemy camp, your heart jumps. Eventually, the shouting rises. The battle is about to begin. You hear the first twang of bows being drawn, and suddenly the sky darkens with arrows. This isn't like in a video game where you can dodge them. The arrows fall by the hundreds, and you don't know where they'll land. Men cry out, struck in the arms, the neck, the face. One falls right next to you, clutching his thigh where the arrowhead tore through. You're frozen in place, gripping your spear tighter, waiting for your turn. You look up and see the rain of arrows coming down again, and you duck, but there's no real protection. You pray silently that one doesn't hit you. Then comes the sound of drums and footsteps. The enemy is advancing. You hear the ground rumble under the weight of men marching in formation. The commanders yell at you to hold steady, to keep your line tight. Your arms ache from holding the spear out in front of you. Your mouth is so dry you can't even swallow. And then, suddenly, they're there. The enemy soldiers crash into your line like a tidal wave. You're shoved back, almost falling. The man next to you goes down, and before you can even look, is trampled underfoot. You thrust your spear forward, not even sure if you hit anything. The noise is unbearable, screams, metal clashing, horses neighing, men begging for help. Time stops making sense. Seconds feel like hours. You're pushed forward and back, jostled between bodies. Blood sprays across your face, and you don't know if it's yours or someone else's. You realize you've lost your shield, or maybe you never had one. Someone slams into you from the side, and you stumble. You see the flash of steel as a sword comes down, and instinct makes you duck. It slices across the shoulder of the man behind you. He cries out and collapses, dragging two others down with him. You don't even have time to react before another push shoves you forward again. This is only the beginning. Battles could last for hours, grinding down both sides until one broke. And for you, standing in the mud, shaking with fear, and struggling just to breathe inside the hot helmet, it feels endless. You realize now that survival isn't about bravery or skill. It's about sheer luck, whether the arrow misses you, whether the sword strikes someone else, whether you can stay on your feet while the chaos swallows you. And luck, as history shows, runs out quickly on a medieval battlefield. As you take this all in, you start to understand why people today, no matter how tough they think they are, wouldn't survive a single day out there. The conditions, the fear, the exhaustion, the overwhelming violence, it's more than the modern mind or body could handle. And this is just the first section of our journey tonight. We're only scratching the surface of what made medieval battles so brutal. In the next parts, we'll go deeper into the weight of armor, the formations, the cavalry charges, the injuries, and the aftermath. But for now, picture yourself standing there, trembling in the morning mist, clutching a wooden spear you barely know how to use, with thousands of enemies charging toward you. That's how your story begins on a medieval battlefield. And it's probably how it would end. The sun is finally starting to rise, though the light doesn't bring comfort. It spreads across the foggy landscape in weak rays, glinting off scattered puddles of mud and the steel helmets of men already lined up. You've stepped out from the camp and onto the field itself, and the sheer scale of what you see is enough to make your knees feel weak. Forget the neat little skirmishes you imagined from movies. This is not a duel or a staged fight. This is an entire valley filled with people preparing to kill one another. You stand on a patch of uneven ground, still damp from rain the night before. The mud clings to your boots, sucking at them each time you shift your weight. In front of you, hundreds of men are already arranging themselves into formations. To your left, you see rows of archers stringing their bows, testing the tension by pulling back the strings and letting them snap forward. Some chew on bits of leather or cloth to calm their nerves. To your right, Armored infantry stand in tighter ranks, shields held upright, spears angled slightly forward. Behind you, horses snort and stomp, their riders tightening straps and adjusting saddles. The animals look restless, aware that chaos is coming. The noise is overwhelming. Dozens of different sounds blend together into one steady roar. Men shouting orders. Others laughing too loudly, pretending they aren't scared. The pounding of drums keeping a rhythm for the ranks to move in. The clank of metal as weapons are lifted and tested. Every few seconds, you hear the dull thunk of a mallet striking a wooden stake into the ground to secure tents or barriers. It's not just noise, it's confusion. You don't know which voice to listen to, which direction to look. Everyone seems to know where to go except you, and that realization makes your chest tighten. The smell is another assault. The battlefield doesn't smell like fresh grass and morning dew. It's a foul mixture of unwashed bodies, manure from the horses, and smoke from the torches that burn even in daylight. Somewhere, a soldier is vomiting. Another has soiled himself before the fighting has even begun. These are things nobody tells you about. Nobody prepares you for the fact that fear smells. It lingers in the air like sweat, thick and sour, clinging to your clothes. A captain walks by, barking commands. His face is hard, scarred from past battles. He doesn't even look at you directly, only at the line you're supposed to form. You shuffle into position, gripping your spear so tightly your knuckles turn white. Around you, men do the same. Some are old, their faces lined and weary. Others are young, barely out of boyhood, their eyes darting nervously in every direction. Everyone is pretending they belong here. But if you look close, you can see the cracks, the trembling hands, the shallow breathing, the constant glances at the horizon where the enemy waits. And then you see them. Across the field, beyond the low fog, the enemy army is assembling too. At first they are just shapes in the distance, dark masses shifting like shadows. But as the light strengthens, you make out the details. Banners flapping, armored men glinting in the morning sun, cavalry forming lines with long lances pointing skyward. It's one thing to know you're going into battle. It's another to see the actual human beings preparing to kill you. They don't look weaker than you. They don't look scared. They look like a mirror image, just as ready, just as determined, just as deadly. Your throat tightens as you realize how far the battlefield stretches. It's not a small clearing. It's acres upon acres, fields that might once have grown crops, now trampled into churned mud by thousands of boots. The horizon itself is lined with soldiers. You couldn't run if you wanted to, there's nowhere to go. Behind you is your own army. Ahead of you is the enemy. And all around you is the press of men who will not move aside for your panic. The commanders continue to ride back and forth, their horses splashing mud onto anyone standing too close. They shout words about honor, duty, and victory, but those words slide past you. They're not for you. They're for morale. Deep down, you already understand your individual survival isn't the point. You're not here as a person. You're here as part of a wall of bodies, meant to absorb the shock when the enemy hits. The waiting begins again. Hours stretch on, and you're left standing under the pale sun with nothing to do but think. Your legs ache. Your shoulders burn from holding the spear. Sweat trickles down your back despite the chill. You shift your weight and get elbowed by the man next to you, who growls at you to stand still. The longer you stand, the heavier the silence between bursts of noise feels. Every so often, a scout rushes back with information, whispering urgently to the captains. Drums sound again. Lines shift slightly. You try to focus on the routine movements, but your mind keeps circling back to the same thought: what's going to happen to me when the fighting starts? Time slows. Every detail becomes sharp. You notice the mud stuck under your fingernails. You hear the nervous muttering of the man 2 spots down, reciting a prayer over and over. You see the horsehair crest on a knight's helmet bending in the breeze. These small details root you in the moment, yet they also make it unbearable, because you can't escape into distraction. You're here, fully here, trapped in this gathering storm. Finally, a horn sounds. The kind that makes the ground seem to vibrate under your feet. The signal passes down the line. You're told to step forward, to tighten ranks, to lower your spear into position. Your heartbeat spikes so hard you feel it in your throat. Your arms shake as you angle the spear outward. The man beside you glances at you for the first time all morning, his eyes wide and bloodshot. There's no camaraderie in the look, just the unspoken truth that you're both standing on the edge of something that neither of you can control. From across the valley, the enemy answers with their own horn. Then another. The sound echoes, rising and overlapping until it feels like the sky itself is splitting open. You can see their banners swaying as they begin to march. A ripple moves through their formation, like a dark tide rolling toward you. This is it. All the waiting, all the dread, has built to this moment. And yet, even as the first enemy lines advance, you're still stuck in disbelief. You can't process that in just minutes, maybe seconds, people will be dying all around you. That the field you're standing on, now just damp earth and trampled grass, will be soaked in blood. Your hand sweats so much the spear slips, and you have to grip it harder. Your knees feel weak, as if they might give out before the fighting even begins. This is the arrival on the battlefield. Not the fight itself, not yet. Just the preparation. And already, you feel like you've reached your limit. The noise, the smells, the endless waiting, the sight of the enemy stretching across the horizon, it's overwhelming. You realize with dawning clarity that you're not ready for this. Nobody is, not truly. Even the veterans who have survived other battles look grim, their faces set in lines of resignation. They know what's coming. You don't, not fully. But you're about to learn. And so you stand, trembling in your boots, shoulder to shoulder with strangers who are as fragile as you are, staring across a valley at men who are just as eager to survive by killing you first. The battlefield has welcomed you, and already, before a single sword has clashed, you understand why you wouldn't survive it. If you've ever worn a heavy backpack for more than an hour, you know the dull ache that creeps into your shoulders, the way your back stiffens, and how your legs start to complain with every step. Now imagine that feeling multiplied by 5, maybe even 10, and spread across your entire body. That's what it was like to wear armor on a medieval battlefield. People often think of knights in shining plate armor, walking like tanks and shrugging off blows with ease. But the reality of armor was far more complicated. It was heavy, exhausting, and suffocating. For someone like you, untrained and unprepared, just wearing the equipment would drain your strength long before you even lifted a weapon. Let's start with the basics. Most common soldiers didn't get full suits of armor. They were expensive and difficult to make, fitted for wealthier men who could afford them. Instead, you would most likely be wearing a padded garment called a gambeson. This was essentially a thick, quilted jacket stuffed with layers of linen or wool. It worked as a form of protection against cuts, but it was hot and heavy. Imagine wearing a thick winter coat on a summer's day, then running laps around a muddy field in it. That's what your body would feel like after just a few minutes. The gambeson absorbed sweat like a sponge, and once soaked, it clung to your body, making it even harder to move. If you were lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, you might have chainmail added on top of the gambeson. A mail shirt, called a hauberk, could weigh anywhere from 20 to 40 pounds. That might not sound too bad, but it wasn't like carrying the weight on your back in a neat little pack. The weight was spread across your entire upper body, pulling down on your shoulders, tugging at your arms, and swaying slightly as you moved. Every step, every swing, every breath was a little harder. And mail didn't distribute weight evenly. It shifted. When you leaned forward, it dragged you down. When you tried to raise your arm, the mail pulled at your shoulder, making even simple movements feel sluggish. Then there were helmets. Forget the polished, Hollywood-style helmets with wide-open visors. The reality was far more claustrophobic. A common infantry helmet might be a simple iron cap that barely fit your head, pressing against your skull. More advanced helms enclosed the face, with only small slits for vision and breathing. Imagine standing in a hot, crowded room, then putting a metal bucket over your head with two narrow holes punched in front. Your field of vision instantly narrows. You can't see to the sides without turning your entire body. Your hearing is muffled, replaced by the constant echo of your own breath inside the metal shell. If you panic, the helmet only makes the feeling worse, as the air grows hot and damp within minutes. And this is before you even consider weapons. You might picture yourself holding a sword because that's the image we've all grown up with. But swords were rare for ordinary foot soldiers. They were expensive, crafted by skilled smiths, and usually reserved for wealthier men. More likely, you would be given a spear, a polearm, or maybe an axe or mace. A spear sounds simple, but holding one out in front of you for an extended period quickly burns your arms and shoulders. The shaft is long and awkward, often around 6 to 8 feet, and keeping it steady while standing in formation is exhausting. After half an hour, your arms would tremble just from the effort of holding it in place. Polearms, like halberds, added more weight at the end, making them even harder to balance. Swinging one took strength and practice, and missing your target left you open to counterattack. Axes and maces were brutal weapons, but they weren't light either. A one-handed war axe might weigh 3 to 5 pounds, but that's 3 to 5 pounds of iron attached to a wooden shaft, swung repeatedly while wearing armor. Try holding a hammer above your head for 5 minutes, and you'll understand what it does to your muscles. Now imagine doing that while someone is actively trying to kill you. Knights, of course, had full plate armor by the late Middle Ages. A complete suit could weigh 45 to 70 pounds, though it was better distributed than chainmail. Contrary to the myths, knights could run and fight in plate. But they had trained their entire lives for it, building the stamina and strength needed to function under that much metal. For you, putting on such armor would be like strapping on a weighted vest that you can't take off. You'd be able to walk, maybe jog, but after a few minutes of swinging a sword or blocking blows, your lungs would be screaming, your arms would feel like lead, and your legs would threaten to give out. Even carrying a shield was more work than you'd expect. A medium-sized shield might weigh 10 to 15 pounds. Holding it upright, braced against incoming blows, was exhausting after only a short while. And a shield wasn't just dead weight, it required constant adjustment, moving up, down, left, right, to protect against attacks from every angle. In a shield wall, where you and dozens of others pressed shoulder to shoulder with shields interlocked, the weight increased tenfold because you weren't just holding your shield, you were holding back the push of enemy bodies slamming into you. Now think about how all of this equipment interacts. You're wearing a sweaty, heavy gambeson. On top of that is chainmail that drags at your arms. Over that is a helmet that limits your sight and muffles your breathing. You're carrying a long spear or an axe that taxes your grip. You've got a shield strapped to your arm, pulling at your shoulder. Each piece on its own is bearable. Together, they become a prison of iron and wool that drains you before you even see combat. Modern people underestimate how much stamina it took just to function in this gear. If you work an office job, your muscles aren't conditioned for it. Even athletes would struggle, because this wasn't just about bursts of strength, it was about maintaining constant tension in your muscles while under extreme stress. Medieval soldiers trained for years. You'd be exhausted in the first half hour. And exhaustion on a battlefield isn't just uncomfortable, it's deadly. When your arms are too tired to lift your shield, that's when an enemy sword slips past and cuts into your side. When your legs ache too much to keep you standing, that's when you stumble, fall into the mud, and get trampled. When your grip fails, your weapon slips from your hands, leaving you defenseless. On a battlefield, weakness is fatal, and the weight of your equipment makes weakness come faster than you'd ever expect. There's also the heat to consider. Armor wasn't breathable. In summer battles, men collapsed from heat exhaustion just from standing in formation. In winter battles, sweat would freeze against their bodies, chilling them to the bone. Either way, the body was under constant strain. Even professional soldiers had to be rotated out of lines during long engagements because they couldn't endure the weight forever. You, untrained and unused to it, would last minutes before your movement slowed, your breathing grew ragged, and your mind screamed for relief. Movies often show knights dramatically lifting visors or soldiers tossing helmets aside mid-battle. In reality, if you took your helmet off in combat, you were a target. If you dropped your shield because your arm ached, you probably wouldn't get another chance to pick it up. There was no pause button, no water break, no time to adjust. Once the fighting began, you were locked inside your armor until it ended, or until you fell. So when we talk about why you wouldn't survive a medieval battlefield, the weight of the armor and weapons is one of the most immediate reasons. Before you even swung a sword or blocked a blow, the equipment itself would already be fighting against you. It was heavy, suffocating, and unforgiving. And unlike modern sports gear, there was no option to size it correctly or make it comfortable. You wore what you were given. If it didn't fit, too bad. If it chafed your skin raw, too bad. If it pressed on your shoulders until you thought your spine might snap, too bad. The only relief came when the battle ended, or when you no longer had to carry it because you were lying face down in the mud. This was the grim reality of medieval combat equipment. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinematic. It was a test of endurance that most modern people, no matter how strong they think they are, would fail before the fight even began. When we think about medieval battles today, we often picture ourselves holding a weapon and fighting bravely, as if instinct alone would be enough to carry us through. The truth is very different. Training made the difference between life and death on the battlefield, and the gulf between a trained medieval fighter and someone like you, or anyone pulled out of the modern world, was so wide it's hard to even compare. Reality wasn't just about knowing how to swing a weapon. It was about years of conditioning, learning formations, understanding discipline, and hardening your body and mind against fear. Without that training, you wouldn't last long at all. From childhood, many men in the Middle Ages were prepared for violence in ways that most of us can't even imagine. Peasant boys grew up doing heavy labor from the moment they could walk. Farming, chopping wood, hauling water, digging trenches, plowing fields, all of this built endurance and raw strength long before they were ever handed a weapon. By the time a peasant was old enough to be called to war, his muscles and bones had already adapted to constant physical strain. Compare that to a modern person who might spend much of their day sitting at a desk, driving a car, or relaxing indoors. The foundation alone, the basic physical readiness, would already be missing. Knights, on the other hand, trained deliberately from early youth. A noble boy destined to become a knight began his path as a page, then a squire. He learned how to care for armor and horses, how to wield weapons, and how to follow the strict codes of his household. Training was constant and brutal. Sword drills weren't just about swinging, they were about repetition until the muscles remembered movements automatically. Shield practice wasn't just about blocking once or twice, it was about holding the shield steady while being hammered again and again, until the arm could withstand the pounding without dropping. Wrestling and grappling were taught, because battle often turned into close, desperate struggles on the ground. Even horseback skills were drilled endlessly. By adulthood, a knight wasn't just someone with armor. He was a trained machine built to function under pressure. And then there's formation fighting. In movies, we see battles dissolve into one-on-one duels, but in reality, formations were the backbone of survival. Shield walls, spear lines, pike blocks, and cavalry wedges required every man to know his role and hold his position. A soldier who panicked and broke formation didn't just doom himself, he endangered the entire line. Training wasn't just about individual skill. It was about discipline. Soldiers had to learn to trust that the man beside them would hold, that the wall wouldn't break, and that their best chance of survival was to act as part of a larger unit. Without that drilled-in discipline, a modern person would instinctively try to run or swing wildly, breaking the cohesion that kept everyone alive. Now imagine yourself on that field without training. You're holding a spear, but you don't know how to brace it properly. When the enemy charges, instead of planting the butt against the ground and angling it toward the oncoming soldiers, you grip it like a broom and try to jab forward. The force of impact would rip it from your hands or shove you back so hard you fall. The trained men next to you would lock their spears into place, forming a deadly wall. You'd just be a gap in the line, a weak spot waiting to be exploited. Or picture yourself with a sword. Maybe you think you'd swing it like in a movie, a big heroic slash across the enemy. In reality, that kind of wide swing would leave you open to immediate counterattack. Medieval sword fighting relied on controlled strikes, thrusts, and parries. It was about efficiency, not drama. Trained fighters aimed for weaknesses in armor, under the armpit, at the joints, through the visor slit. You, swinging wildly, would tire yourself out in seconds, miss your mark, and invite a blade straight into your exposed side. Even archery required years of practice. A medieval longbowman wasn't just a guy with a bow. He had trained since boyhood, pulling a bow so heavy that modern people can barely draw it back once. The force required was often 100 to 150 pounds of pull weight. That's not something you pick up casually. It literally reshaped the bodies of longbowmen, giving them thickened bones and uneven muscle growth in their arms and shoulders. If someone like you picked up a longbow on the battlefield, you probably couldn't even pull it back far enough to launch an arrow, let alone do it dozens of times in quick succession under fire. Then there's the mental aspect of training. Medieval soldiers were hardened by a world where violence was constant. Executions, punishments, and street fights were public. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals, it happened in homes, in villages, in front of children. By the time a man went to war, he had already seen suffering and blood. He knew what it meant for someone to die. A modern person, even one who consumes violent media, hasn't been conditioned in the same way. The shock of seeing real, gruesome wounds, of hearing screams and smelling blood, would likely freeze you in place. Trained soldiers had drilled themselves to keep moving forward despite the horror. Without that, you'd be paralyzed by fear. Training also meant building stamina for long battles. Medieval combat wasn't a 5-minute skirmish. Clashes could last for hours, with soldiers expected to hold lines, push forward, retreat in order, and repeat. Training conditioned men to pace themselves, to conserve strength, to fight in rhythm with the formation. You, with no experience, would burn all your energy in the first frantic moments, leaving you helpless afterward. Think, too, about endurance outside of the actual fight. Soldiers had to march miles just to reach the battlefield. They carried their weapons and gear the entire way, often across uneven ground, through forests, or up hills. By the time they arrived, they were already sweating and tired. Training built the resilience to keep going after such marches. You, untrained, might be exhausted before the battle even began. And on the march back, if you survived, the fatigue would be crushing. Training prepared men for that cycle of exertion. Reality would break you long before combat even started. Another part of training was learning commands and signals. On the battlefield, you couldn't hear instructions shouted over the roar of thousands of men. Soldiers relied on horn calls, drum beats, and banner signals. Training drilled them to recognize and react immediately to those signals without hesitation. You, unfamiliar with them, wouldn't know what to do. When the horn sounded to fall back, you'd stay put. When the banner waved to advance, you'd hesitate. In the confusion, you'd quickly become lost, separated from your unit, and cut down. And finally, training built the will to kill. It may sound blunt, but this is perhaps the most important reality. Fighting isn't just about surviving, it's about ending the life of the person in front of you before they end yours. That required a level of conditioning, of numbing the natural human hesitation to stab, crush, or cut another human being. Soldiers were drilled to push past that hesitation. For you, the first time you faced someone's eyes and raised your weapon, you might freeze. That single moment of doubt would be enough. The enemy wouldn't hesitate. They'd thrust, slash, or smash, and you'd be on the ground, learning the harsh difference between imagining violence and facing it. So when we talk about training versus reality, it's not just about skill with a sword. It's about a lifetime of preparation, physical, mental, and emotional, that you simply don't have. Reality doesn't wait for you to learn. It doesn't give you time to adapt. The moment the clash begins, you're either prepared or you're not. And if you're not, the battlefield has no mercy. This is why you wouldn't survive a medieval battlefield. Training wasn't optional. It was the only thing standing between you and death. And in your case, reality would expose the gap instantly. Even if you could somehow drag yourself onto the battlefield wearing the armor and holding the weapon, even if you managed to stand in formation without collapsing from exhaustion, there's another force waiting for you. It's not physical like the weight of chainmail or the heaviness of a shield. It's the crushing mental impact of facing the raw brutality of medieval combat for the very first time. This is the part that training could prepare soldiers for, but you, coming from the modern world, would never be ready for. It's the psychological shock, the sheer overload of sights, sounds, and smells, that would hit you harder than any sword swing. The first thing you would notice is the noise. Movies often underplay this. They use dramatic soundtracks or highlight a few clashing swords, but a real battlefield was closer to a storm of chaos. Thousands of men shouting at once. The pounding of drums keeping the rhythm of formations. Horns signaling orders across the field. Horses screaming as they were stabbed or knocked to the ground. The whistle of arrows raining down. And above all of it, the screams of fear, of pain, of dying men calling for their mothers, their gods, or simply screaming with no words at all. The human brain can only process so much, and in that storm, you wouldn't know what to focus on. Every sound is urgent. Every sound is terrifying. It doesn't feel like a soundtrack. It feels like being trapped inside a collapsing building, except the collapse doesn't stop, it just keeps roaring louder. Then there are the sights. When you look around, you see not just enemies but men who look like you, terrified, shaking, clutching their weapons with pale knuckles. Some charge forward bravely. Others freeze, unable to move. Some turn and try to run, only to be cut down from behind by their own commanders for desertion. You would see men trampled by horses, crushed into the mud until they stopped moving. You would see arrows sticking out of bodies in places you didn't think possible, through arms, through cheeks, through throats. Blood would be everywhere, not in neat cinematic spurts, but soaking into clothing, dripping from wounds, spraying in sudden bursts when an artery was cut. The color of the field changes before your eyes. What began as brown mud and green grass turns darker and darker until it's red and black with gore. And then there are the smells. This is something nobody prepares you for. The smell of iron from fresh blood, sharp and metallic, clinging to your nostrils. The stink of sweat pouring from thousands of unwashed bodies. The sour stench of fear, because fear has a smell, and it hangs heavy when men lose control of themselves in terror. Add to that the stink of vomit, because many men threw up from nerves before and during battle. And as time passes, there's the smell of waste, because some soldiers soiled themselves when struck by panic or when their bodies gave out. Imagine all of that, layered together, carried on the wind and pressing down into your lungs with every breath. For someone from the modern world, used to sanitized environments, that kind of sensory overload would be unbearable. Your eyes wouldn't just see death. They'd see mutilation. Medieval weapons weren't clean. They crushed, hacked, and tore. Swords chopped into bone. Maces smashed skulls, leaving faces unrecognizable. Arrows lodged in eyes or groins. Men lost limbs, and sometimes those limbs dangled half-attached by strips of flesh. Horses stumbled and rolled onto riders, crushing them into the mud. You might see someone's jaw hanging loose, or a man trying to stuff his intestines back into his stomach while crawling away. These were real sights on real battlefields, and they weren't rare, they were constant. The shock of seeing even one of these things could traumatize a modern person for life. On a battlefield, you'd see dozens in the first few minutes. Psychological shock isn't just about the gore, though. It's about the sudden realization that death is seconds away. At home, you think of death as distant, something that happens eventually. On a medieval battlefield, death is immediate. You see it inches from your face. The man next to you, someone you were standing shoulder to shoulder with moments ago, suddenly collapses, his skull split open. 1 second alive, the next second gone. That shock never fades. For a modern mind, it's paralyzing. Instead of fighting, you'd probably freeze, staring at what just happened, unable to process that it could happen to you any second. And when you freeze, you die. Because in that moment of hesitation, someone's blade finds you. Trained soldiers had seen enough to move anyway, to push past the fear. You would not. That's the cruel difference between training and being dropped suddenly into the horror. There's also the shock of randomness. On a battlefield, you realize quickly that survival isn't about fairness. It's not the strongest man who always lives. It's not the bravest or the most skilled. Sometimes it's just luck. You could be fighting hard, doing everything right, and still be killed instantly by an arrow you never saw coming. You could be untouched all day, only to be crushed when a horse stumbles and falls on you. That randomness shatters the mind because it destroys the illusion of control. A modern person, used to thinking in terms of plans and choices, would break under that sudden understanding, nothing you do might matter. Death can come at any second, and it doesn't care about your effort. And then there's the sound of dying. This stays with people more than anything else. The groans, the gurgles, the cries of men begging for water, for mercy, for help that never comes. Some call out for their mothers like children. Others just scream until their voices give out. Those sounds echo in your head, even if you survive. Veterans were haunted by them for life. For you, hearing them for the first time, it would be overwhelming. You might cover your ears. You might cry without even realizing it. Your mind would struggle to protect itself, but there's no escape from the noise when you're trapped in the middle of the field. Psychological shock isn't just about what happens in the moment, either. Even if by some miracle you survived the day, the images would stay with you. Medieval people didn't talk about post-traumatic stress in the way we do today, but they lived with it. Nightmares, sudden terrors, emotional numbness, these were all part of a soldier's life after battle. And these were men who had been hardened from youth. For you, one battle would likely be enough to scar your mind forever. You might never sleep peacefully again. You might never eat meat again without remembering the smell of human flesh. You might never hear a loud noise again without flinching. And keep in mind, this isn't even the shock of losing. Even in victory, the battlefield was traumatizing. Because victory didn't mean celebration, it meant walking through the field afterward, stepping over the bodies of your comrades, listening to the moans of the dying who couldn't be saved. It meant seeing the faces of people you knew, maybe even friends, twisted in death. Victory often meant looting corpses, stripping armor and weapons from men who were still warm, sometimes still alive but too wounded to resist. To survive, you had to harden yourself against compassion. For a modern person, that kind of coldness is unthinkable. You wouldn't be able to do it. You'd stand there in horror, unable to strip the body of the man beside you. And in that hesitation, you'd fall behind the others, left vulnerable to an enemy counterattack or abandoned on the field. So when you picture yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't imagine swinging a sword like a hero. Imagine your brain struggling to keep up with the overload. Imagine the dizziness, the nausea, the shaking hands. Imagine the ringing in your ears from screams so loud they blur into one long howl. Imagine the panic when you realize you can't think straight anymore. That psychological shock. And that's why you wouldn't survive, because long before your body gave out, your mind would break under the weight of it all. When you picture yourself on a medieval battlefield, it's easy to imagine fighting as an individual. Maybe you see yourself dueling another soldier one-on-one, swinging a sword or clashing shields in some cinematic exchange. The truth is, real battles were not about individual fights. They were about formations, lines of men pressed shoulder to shoulder, fighting as a single unit. Survival depended not on your personal courage, but on whether you could hold your place in that formation. And that's another reason you wouldn't survive. Because without years of drilling and conditioning, the reality of formation fighting would crush you. Formations were the backbone of medieval combat. Infantry fought in ranks, not scattered across the field. Shield walls, spear lines, pike blocks, and disciplined rows of soldiers kept armies from collapsing into chaos. The concept was simple: strength in numbers. One man alone is easy to kill, but 100 men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields locked and spears braced, can hold against cavalry or push back an enemy line. The problem is, simple doesn't mean easy. Holding formation was brutally difficult. It demanded discipline, strength, and above all, the ability to suppress your natural instincts. Let's start with the shield wall. Picture yourself standing in line with dozens of other men. Each of you has a shield, and together you lock them edge to edge, creating a wall of wood and iron. It looks solid, but it only works if every single man holds firm. If one person flinches, lowers their shield, or steps back, a gap opens. The enemy sees it instantly and drives their spear through. The men on either side feel the shift, and panic ripples down the line. Suddenly, the wall isn't a wall anymore, it's a broken fence. The enemy pours through, and the formation collapses. That's the constant pressure. You can't move on instinct. You can't run. You can't even step back to breathe. You have to hold your shield steady no matter what slams into it. And things do slam into it. When two formations clash, it isn't a graceful dance. It's a collision. Imagine a rugby scrum, but with weapons. The impact is so hard it rattles your bones. The shields slam together, pressing against your arm and chest. The men behind you shove forward, trying to push the wall ahead. You're caught in the middle, squeezed so tightly you can barely breathe. Your legs strain just to keep standing. Mud sucks at your boots as hundreds of pounds of force drive into you. If you fall, you don't get up. You're trampled underfoot. Now add weapons into the mix. Spears and swords jab through the tiny gaps between shields. You hear the thud of blows striking wood, the crack of shields splintering, the grunt of the man beside you as an enemy blade slips past and cuts into his arm. Your instinct might be to duck, to cover your head, to retreat. But you can't. You have to trust the formation. That's what training drilled into medieval soldiers: hold steady, no matter what. Without that discipline, you'd flinch at the first strike, exposing yourself and the men beside you. Think about the sheer stamina it takes. Holding a shield up for minutes is tiring enough. Holding it for hours, under constant pressure, while pushing against enemy bodies and blocking strikes, that's superhuman for someone untrained. Your arm would burn within minutes. Your grip would weaken. Sweat would drip into your eyes, blurring your vision. You'd feel the weight of the shield growing heavier with every second, until your muscles screamed for relief. And there's no relief. You can't lower the shield. You can't step out. The moment you do, you doom yourself and your unit. Spear formations were even more demanding. In a pike block, dozens of men stood shoulder to shoulder with pikes or spears up to 18 feet long. The front ranks lowered their weapons to form a wall of spikes. The ranks behind held theirs at angles to cover gaps. Together, it created a deadly hedgehog that cavalry feared to charge. But holding an 18-foot pole steady isn't simple. The weight drags on your arms. The length makes it unwieldy. And when the enemy crashes into the front, the shock travels down the shaft, slamming into your hands and shoulders. It's like trying to hold back a charging bull with a broomstick. You'd lose your grip almost instantly. Trained soldiers learn to brace the butt of the spear against the ground, to absorb the force with their whole body. You wouldn't know how. The impact would knock the weapon from your hands, leaving you exposed. Formations also demanded unity. You couldn't just swing wildly at the enemy. Every movement had to be controlled so you didn't strike your own men. If you lunged too far forward, you broke the line. If you stumbled back, you opened a gap. That constant awareness of your neighbors, the need to move as one body, was drilled through endless training. Without it, you'd be out of sync. You'd bump into the man beside you, throw off his rhythm, and weaken the entire group. And the noise made it worse. In the crush of battle, you couldn't hear clear instructions. Commanders shouted, but their voices were swallowed by the roar of combat. Orders were given through horns, drums, or banners, and you had to recognize them instantly. Soldiers trained to react automatically, advance when the drum beat quickened, hold when the horn sounded, retreat when the banner dipped. You wouldn't know any of it. While the rest of your unit pressed forward in unison, you'd hesitate, confused, and suddenly you'd be alone, cut off, an easy prey. Cavalry charges added another layer of terror. Imagine standing in a spear line as dozens of armored horses thunder toward you. The ground shakes. The sound is deafening. Your instinct screams at you to run. Every fiber of your body tells you to get out of the way. But if you run, you die. The only way to survive is to hold steady, brace your spear, and trust the formation. That's what training drilled into soldiers: suppress instinct, replace it with discipline. Without that, you break and run at the first sight of charging horses. And once one man runs, panic spreads. A formation that takes months to train can collapse in seconds because of one weak link. On that battlefield, you would be the weak link. Even when formations held, the fighting was brutal. In the press of bodies, you couldn't swing freely. Most strikes were short thrusts, quick jabs through gaps in armor or between shields. The fighting was face to face, inches apart, with no room to breathe. You smelled the enemy's breath, saw the spit fly as he shouted, felt the heat of his body pressed against the shield. In that chaos, you'd be overwhelmed. You'd forget to thrust, forget to block, forget to hold your shield high. And in that moment of distraction, a spear point would find your throat or a blade would slash your thigh. Formations weren't just physical, they were psychological. They gave soldiers the courage to stand because they weren't alone. They were part of a wall, part of something larger. But you wouldn't feel that unity. You'd feel trapped, crushed between bodies, unable to move or breathe. The pressure would mount until you panicked. And panic is deadly in formation fighting. If you push back to escape, you trip the men behind you. If you lunge forward alone, you're cut down instantly. If you freeze, the line falters around you. In every case, your inexperience becomes a weakness that the enemy exploits. Think about how unnatural it feels. Instinct tells you to flee from danger, to turn and run when faced with overwhelming force. Training teaches soldiers to suppress that instinct, to hold even as death rushes toward them. Without years of conditioning, you wouldn't be able to do it. The moment the enemy slammed into you, your body would betray you. Your knees would buckle, your arms would drop, and you'd be swept away in the tide of men. And the truth is, even trained formations often broke. History is full of battles where shield walls collapsed, pike blocks were scattered, or units panicked and fled. When that happened, the slaughter was horrific. Soldiers in formation at least had a chance. Soldiers running in panic were cut down like animals. And you, untrained and unconditioned, would almost certainly be one of the first to break, one of the first to run, and one of the first to die. So when you imagine yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't picture a heroic duel. Picture yourself crushed in a wall of shields, pressed so tightly you can't breathe, holding a spear so heavy your arms shake, listening to the roar of thousands of men as the enemy slams into you. Picture the terror as cavalry thunders closer, the panic as arrows rain down, the exhaustion as your muscles give out. That's formation fighting. And that's another reason you wouldn't survive, because surviving wasn't about bravery, it was about discipline, training, and endurance. Things you don't have, and things reality wouldn't give you time to learn. If the clash of formations and the weight of armor weren't enough to break you, there was another danger on the battlefield that you couldn't control, no matter how skilled or disciplined you were, the endless rain of arrows and bolts from bows and crossbows. This wasn't a duel. This wasn't face-to-face combat where you could at least see the man trying to kill you. This was death falling from the sky, silent one moment and screaming the next, and it was one of the most terrifying parts of medieval warfare. Picture yourself standing in formation, shoulder to shoulder with your comrades. The ground is already slick with mud, the air thick with noise. Suddenly, you hear the sharp, stretching creak of hundreds of bowstrings being drawn at once. It's a sound unlike anything you've heard before, a long, tense groan that fills the air. Then, for a moment, there's silence. That silence is worse than the noise, because you know what's coming next. And then you hear it, the whistle. Thousands of arrows cutting through the air at terrifying speed. You look up, and the sky itself seems to darken. A black cloud rises high, arcs forward, and begins to fall. In that instant, you realize there's nothing you can do. You can't dodge. You can't block every arrow. You grip your shield tighter and duck your head, hoping by chance you're not in the wrong place. The sound of impact surrounds you in seconds. Thuds as arrows slam into shields. Sharp cracks as shafts splinter against helmets. Dull, sickening thunks as arrowheads sink into flesh. Screams erupt around you as men fall, clutching their arms, legs, or faces. Some die instantly, an arrow buried in the throat or the eye. Others stumble and cry out, the shaft protruding from their chest or stomach, leaving them alive but broken. This isn't one volley. Archers were trained to fire in rhythm, loosing arrows again and again. A skilled longbowman could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Multiply that by hundreds, even thousands, and you're standing under a storm that never ends. Every few seconds, another wave comes whistling down. You crouch behind your shield, praying, but there's no safety. The man next to you, who was fine one moment, suddenly jerks back with an arrow through his cheek. The man in front of you collapses, pierced in the back of the neck. You want to close your eyes, but closing them doesn't stop the noise, the relentless hiss of arrows slicing air, the screams as they find their targets, the groans of men collapsing into the mud. Longbows were devastating. They weren't simple hunting bows. A proper war bow could draw weights of 100 to 150 pounds. That meant the arrows it fired carried enough force to pierce armor at medium range. Even mail and padded gambesons offered no guarantee of safety. The bodkin arrowhead, a narrow, hardened point, was designed specifically to punch through iron links and drive deep into flesh. If you think holding a shield makes you safe, remember this: shields could be penetrated. Even when they held, the impact could knock your arm numb. And with volleys raining constantly, no one could keep a shield up forever. Then there were crossbows. Slower to reload but even deadlier in sheer force, a crossbow could send a bolt through a knight's plate armor at close range. Imagine standing in formation, glancing up just in time to see a short, heavy bolt slamming into the chest of the man beside you, punching through steel and dropping him instantly. The reload time gave you no comfort. On a battlefield, crossbowmen worked in rotation, lines firing while others reloaded, keeping a steady stream of bolts flying. Each one could kill instantly. The psychological effect was brutal. Facing an enemy in close combat was terrifying, but at least you could see them, fight back, swing your weapon. Against arrows, you were helpless. You had no control. You could be the strongest, bravest man in your line, and still die in an instant from an arrow you never saw coming. That helplessness crushed morale. Soldiers learned to stand firm anyway, but you, coming from a world where danger is usually visible and avoidable, would likely break. You'd see the sky darken with another volley and your legs would twitch, ready to run. You'd grip your shield so hard your hands went numb, then lower it out of sheer exhaustion at the worst possible moment. And think about what happens when you're hit. Movies show arrows as quick deaths, but most wounds weren't instantly fatal. An arrow through the thigh left you bleeding and crippled, screaming in agony. An arrow in the arm made you drop your weapon and shield, turning you into a target. Arrows through the stomach caused slow, agonizing deaths from infection. Even if the arrow didn't kill you, it took you out of the fight. And battlefield medicine was brutal, removing an arrow often caused more damage than leaving it in. If you were hit, your chances of survival weren't much better than if you'd fallen to a sword. The volleys also broke formations. When a line of soldiers stood together, arrows fell indiscriminately. Some men went down, leaving gaps. Others ducked, lowering their shields, exposing those beside them. Panic spread quickly. Holding formation under arrow fire took incredible discipline. Without it, the line shattered. Imagine yourself in that situation, surrounded by men collapsing, arrows slamming into the ground around you, your own shield shaking from impact. Could you keep standing? Or would you crouch, curl into a ball, maybe even turn to run? That's the difference training made. For you, untrained, the psychological shock of arrows alone would probably be enough to break you before you even saw the enemy's face. Arrows didn't just kill, they prepared the enemy's way. Generals used archers to weaken formations before sending in infantry or cavalry. By the time the melee began, the line was already bleeding, broken, and exhausted from standing under constant fire. If you somehow survived the volleys, you'd be facing the enemy already shaken and rattled, your nerves shredded. When they crashed into you with swords and spears, you'd barely have the strength to lift your weapon. There's another detail often overlooked, the sound. The whistle of thousands of arrows cutting through the air at once is unforgettable. It starts as a faint hiss, then grows until it feels like the air itself is alive. The thuds, cracks, and screams that follow are overwhelming. And it doesn't happen just once, it repeats, over and over, until your brain can't process the noise anymore. You'd be fighting not just the enemy, but the panic rising in your chest every time the sky darkened with another volley. Even after the battle, arrows haunted survivors. Many men carried wounds for life, arrowheads lodged too deep to remove, scars from where shafts tore through flesh, twisted limbs from injuries that never healed properly. Some veterans limped forever, reminders of a moment when the sky itself seemed to turn against them. So when you imagine yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't just picture swords and shields. Picture the sky filling with death. Picture yourself gripping a shield, crouched in terror, listening to the whistle and thud of arrows raining down. Picture the randomness of it, the way survival comes down to inches, to whether the arrow strikes you or the man beside you. Picture the helplessness of knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. That's what arrows and crossbows brought to medieval battle. And that's why, even if you somehow managed to endure the weight of armor, the shock of noise, and the crush of formation, the sky itself would probably be the thing that killed you. If there was one sight that struck fear into the hearts of medieval foot soldiers more than any other, it was the charge of cavalry. Infantry formations could endure arrow storms, withstand the press of enemy spears, and hold a shield wall against men just like themselves. But when dozens or even hundreds of horses thundered across the battlefield, the ground shaking beneath their hooves, the experience was something else entirely. Facing cavalry was like facing a force of nature. No matter how much discipline you thought you had, when that wall of flesh, muscle, and iron came at you, every part of your body screamed to run. Imagine yourself standing in line, gripping your spear, trying to steady your breathing. The noise of battle is already overwhelming. Then you hear it, distant at first, like thunder on the horizon. The steady pounding grows louder, faster, until you feel it in your chest as much as you hear it in your ears. The ground vibrates beneath your feet. Dust rises in clouds across the field, and through it you see them, armored riders on massive warhorses, lances angled forward, banners fluttering. They aren't walking. They aren't trotting. They are charging, full speed, directly at you. Your instincts betray you instantly. Every nerve in your body screams that standing still is suicide. Horses weigh half a ton or more, and at a full gallop, the impact is unstoppable. You want to turn and run, to get out of the way. But training told medieval soldiers to hold firm. The only defense was to plant your spear, brace it against the ground, and hope the line held. That's what training drilled into them: do not move. Do not flinch. Do not run. Because the moment you broke formation, cavalry tore through you like a hot knife through butter. For you, with no training, standing in that line would be impossible. The sight alone would shatter your nerve. The thunder of hooves, the screams of the riders, the blur of steel and horseflesh, it would overwhelm your senses. Even if you tried to hold steady, your arms would shake, your spear would waver, and at the crucial moment you'd falter. That tiny hesitation, multiplied across a line, was all cavalry needed to break through. And when cavalry broke through, the results were catastrophic. Horses slammed into bodies with crushing force. A single warhorse could bowl over several men in an instant. Riders swung swords, axes, or maces from above, cutting down anyone too slow to react. The weight of a horse, combined with the speed of the charge, turned lances into devastating weapons. A lance strike could pierce through armor, driving straight through a chest or stomach. Even if it didn't kill instantly, the force could throw you off your feet, leaving you sprawled in the mud as hooves trampled past. The brutality wasn't just in the impact. Cavalry were trained to exploit chaos. Once a formation broke, riders wheeled around, cutting down fleeing soldiers from behind. There was no art running a mounted knight. A man on foot could never match the speed of a horse. If you ran, you were hunted down, stabbed in the back, or trampled. The only hope was to stay in formation, but for someone like you, with no experience, the instinct to flee would overpower everything else. Consider the horses themselves. These weren't small farm animals. War horses were bred and trained for size, strength, and aggression. They were conditioned not to shy away from noise, blood, or violence. A charging destrier could weigh over 1,200 pounds. At full gallop, it was a battering ram on legs. People sometimes imagine that soldiers could simply stab the horses, but in reality, it was far harder. Horses moved fast, their heads and chests protected by armor, and their sheer size made them difficult targets. Trying to strike one in the chaos of battle was like trying to hit a charging truck with a stick. For you, untrained, it would be nearly impossible. The intimidation factor alone was enough to shatter unsteady troops. Medieval commanders often used cavalry not just to kill, but to terrify. The sight of a cavalry charge could send poorly trained levies scattering before the horses even made contact. Once panic set in, the cavalry's job was easy: ride down the fleeing soldiers, cut them apart, and leave the field littered with corpses. For someone from the modern world, unfamiliar with this kind of warfare, you would almost certainly be among the first to run. And yet, soldiers did stand against cavalry. How? Through discipline and sheer willpower. Spearmen and pikemen locked together, lowering their weapons into a wall of points. Horses, no matter how well trained, balked at impaling themselves on a hedge of steel. The key was unity. If every man held firm, the formation could stop a charge. But if even a few broke, the line collapsed. That's why discipline mattered more than courage. It wasn't about bravery. It was about obedience. You didn't think. You didn't run. You held your place because everyone else was holding theirs. Without training, you'd be the weak point that brought it all crashing down. Now picture what happens when the line does hold. Cavalry charge, lances shatter against spears, horses rear back in panic. The clash is deafening. Men are thrown from saddles. Some are crushed beneath their own mounts. But victory isn't clean. Even when the line stands, soldiers are still trampled, skewered, or smashed by sheer force. You'd be in the middle of that chaos, pressed tight between comrades, struggling to breathe as the enemy crashes against you. The physical shock alone, horses slamming into shields, riders swinging down at your head, would rattle you to the core. And then comes the close combat. Once lances broke, knights drew swords, axes, or maces. From horseback, they had the advantage of height. They could strike down at your unprotected head or shoulders while you struggled just to reach them with your spear. Their blows carried not just the strength of their arm, but the momentum of the horse beneath them. A mace strike from horseback could split a skull through a helmet. A sword slash could sever an arm before you even saw it coming. You, trying to hold your weapon steady, would be overwhelmed. Even if you somehow avoided being struck, the chaos of a cavalry charge shattered formations. The press of men broke apart, leaving individuals isolated. And once isolated, a foot soldier was doomed. Knights wheeled their horses easily, circling around and cutting down stragglers. You would find yourself alone, panting, your shield slipping, your weapon heavy, and suddenly surrounded by riders who saw you as nothing more than easy prey. And cavalry didn't just fight in open charges. They harassed, they flanked, they pursued. If your army broke and fled, cavalry were the ones who turned retreat into massacre. Foot soldiers could sometimes escape other infantry, but never mounted knights. You'd be cut down long before you reached safety. Even if you threw away your weapons and ran as fast as you could, the thunder of hooves would overtake you. The last thing you'd hear would be the pounding of iron shoes on mud before they trampled you into silence. The brutality of cavalry wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The sight of them charging, the sound of their approach, the knowledge that you couldn't outrun them, it all combined to break morale. Soldiers who had stood firm against arrows or enemy infantry often broke when faced with cavalry. For someone like you, unfamiliar with the discipline required, the terror would be too much. You'd run, and running meant death. So when you think about medieval battle, don't just picture men clashing with swords. Picture yourself standing in a muddy field as the ground shakes beneath your feet, as a wall of horses and armored riders hurtles toward you at full speed. Picture your body screaming at you to flee, your hands trembling too much to hold your spear steady, your breath caught in your throat as the thunder grows louder. That's the brutality of cavalry. And that's another reason you wouldn't survive, because against that kind of force, instinct alone isn't enough. Without training, without discipline, you'd be swept aside like a leaf in a storm. When people think of medieval battles, they often picture a flat, grassy field under a clear blue sky. The kind of scene that looks almost staged, like a tournament ground. But real battlefields were rarely like that. They were unpredictable, dirty, and shaped by the natural world. Mud, rain, snow, heat, and the uneven ground of Europe's countryside all played their part in deciding who lived and who died. And for someone like you, unprepared for even a long hike outdoors, the environment itself would be an enemy. Long before swords or arrows cut you down, the battlefield around you might be the thing that finished you. Let's start with mud. Medieval battles often happened on farmland, meadows, or open fields, places that were chosen not for comfort, but because they could hold large armies. Rain was common, and when thousands of boots, hooves, and wagons churned the soil, the ground quickly turned into a swamp of sticky muck. Soldiers slipped constantly. Imagine trying to stand in formation while your feet sink deeper with every step. Mud clung to boots, weighing them down, making each stride heavier than the last. For a soldier already exhausted from armor and weapons, the mud stole the little strength left in their legs. It wasn't just about slipping. Mud trap people. If you fell, you could be stuck long enough for an enemy to strike before you managed to get up. Heavier soldiers, weighed down by armor, sometimes drowned in the muck if they fell face first and couldn't push themselves up in time. Horses stumbled, throwing riders to the ground. Wagons carrying supplies became stuck, blocking paths and leaving soldiers without food, water, or extra weapons. If you've ever walked across a wet field and felt your shoe nearly pulled off by sticky ground, multiply that by 10, add the chaos of battle, and you'll understand. For you, unused to such conditions, mud would make even standing still an exhausting task. Then there was rain. Rain turned everything worse. Weapons slipped in wet hands. Bowstrings lost tension, making arrows less effective. Helmets collected water, dripping constantly into eyes and mouths. Armor rusted and grew heavier. And cold rain soaked through gambesons, leaving men shivering beneath their armor, teeth chattering, fingers stiff. Imagine standing in a cold downpour for hours, wearing 40 pounds of soaking wet wool and iron, knowing the enemy would still come at you. Your energy would drain, your body stiffen, and your mind grow sluggish. For someone without experience, you'd be ready to collapse before the first clash of weapons. Snow brought its own miseries. In winter battles, soldiers fought with numb fingers and frozen feet. Marching through snowfields in armor was like dragging chains through quicksand. Men slipped on ice, shields became brittle in the cold, and breath came out in clouds that revealed positions. Worse, wounds that might have been survivable in summer often became fatal in winter. A cut that bled in freezing air could cause a man to faint faster. Frostbite took fingers, toes, and ears during long campaigns. You, unused to the bitter cold of a medieval winter without proper clothing or modern insulation, would be shaking uncontrollably within hours. Heat was no kinder. In summer, battles turned armor into ovens. A helmet trapped heat around your head, making it hard to breathe. The padded gambeson beneath mail soaked with sweat, and dehydration struck fast. Soldiers fainted from heat stroke, collapsing in the middle of combat. Some died not from enemy swords but from their own bodies giving out. Even trained men could endure only so long before the heat forced them to slow, stumble, and finally fall. For you, unused to working under the sun with no breaks, no water bottles, and no shade, the heat would destroy you quickly. And then there was the terrain itself. Battlefields weren't designed for fairness. Armies often chose ground that gave them advantage: hills, rivers, forests, marshes. Fighting uphill was exhausting, every step a struggle while the enemy above you had the high ground, momentum, and gravity on their side. Imagine charging uphill in heavy armor while arrows rained down from above. Your lungs would burn, your legs ache, and by the time you reached the enemy, you'd be too exhausted to lift your weapon. Rivers and marshes created even deadlier traps. At the Battle of Agincourt, French knights charged across a narrow, muddy field after rain. The terrain trapped them, horses stumbled, and men fell on top of each other, unable to rise. Thousands were suffocated, trampled, or slaughtered while stuck in the mud. Terrain turned them from warriors into victims. You, with no knowledge of battlefield tactics, would never recognize such dangers until it was too late. You'd march straight into disaster, swept away with the rest. Forests created confusion. In thick woods, formations broke apart. Soldiers lost sight of banners and commanders. Ambushes erupted from nowhere. Arrows whistled out of trees, striking men who never even saw their attackers. Horses panicked at sudden noises. The canopy blocked light, turning the battlefield into a maze of shadows and chaos. For you, used to clear roads and open spaces, the disorientation would be overwhelming. You'd lose your unit, stumble blindly, and likely be cut down in the confusion. Even flat, open ground carried dangers. Dry soil turned to dust under thousands of boots, choking soldiers, blinding them as clouds rose. Men coughed and gagged, eyes streaming, unable to see enemy lines clearly. In some cases, the dust grew so thick that commanders lost track of their own formations. You might think an open field would make things simple, but when the air itself turned opaque with dirt, it became just as suffocating as smoke. Weather and terrain also shaped logistics. Mud delayed supply wagons. Heat spoiled food. Cold froze rivers, blocking trade routes. Armies often starved or weakened before battle even began. You would be no exception. Without proper rations or clean water, your body would falter fast. Imagine going into battle already dizzy from hunger or sick from drinking contaminated water. That was common. Disease spread faster in poor conditions than any sword ever could. Dysentery, fever, and infection often killed more soldiers than combat itself. For you, who lives in a world where clean water is assumed, where roads are paved, and where weather is an inconvenience rather than a death sentence, the shock of facing those raw conditions would be immense. Mud would drag you down. Rain would freeze you. Heat would cook you. Terrain would trip you, trap you, and confuse you. And unlike in your life today, there would be no break, no shelter, no escape. You couldn't step out of the mud. You couldn't duck into air conditioning. You couldn't call for help. You had to endure, or you died. And the truth is, most medieval soldiers endured poorly. Accounts from battles describe men collapsing in exhaustion, drowning in marshes, fainting from heat, or freezing to death after the fighting ended. Victory often went not to the side with the strongest warriors, but to the side that used terrain and weather more effectively. For you, with no knowledge of such tactics and no conditioning for the elements, the environment itself would be fatal. So when you imagine yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't just think about swords and arrows. Think about standing ankle-deep in sticky mud that pulls at your boots until you can barely lift your feet. Think about cold rain dripping down your neck, soaking your gambeson until it weighs twice as much, while your teeth chatter uncontrollably. Think about blazing heat inside a metal helmet, your vision swimming as dizziness overtakes you. Think about trying to climb a hill in armor while arrows fall from above. That's the reality of mud, weather, and terrain. And that's why, long before a sword found your throat, the battlefield itself would have already beaten you. Up to this point, we've walked through the weight of armor, the terror of formations, the helplessness under arrows, and the misery of mud and weather. But none of that fully captures the worst part of a medieval battlefield, close combat. When formations finally clashed, when the arrows had softened the lines and the cavalry had charged, what followed was not a neat duel between warriors. It was chaos. A crush of bodies, a storm of weapons, and a level of violence so raw and merciless that modern people can hardly picture it. This was where men fought at arm's length, face to face, with nothing between them but desperation. And this was the part you would never survive. Imagine the moment when the lines meet. The noise of the charge gives way to the crash of impact. Shields slam together. Spears jab forward. The air is filled with the metallic clang of iron on iron, the dull thud of wood against flesh, and the screams of the wounded. There's no space. You're pressed shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, so close you can't even swing your weapon properly. You don't have room to step back, no room to dodge, no space to retreat. The only way is forward. And in front of you, just inches away, is another man trying to kill you. Movies often show elegant sword fights, long sweeping blows, dramatic parries. Real close combat was nothing like that. It was short, fast, and vicious. A sword wasn't always swung wide, it was thrust into gaps in armor, jammed into armpits or groins, or hammered down against helmets in the hope of denting metal hard enough to knock a man out. Spears weren't just for distance, they were shortened and used like stabbing knives when lines closed. Maces crushed bones. Axes hacked into shoulders, leaving limbs hanging by tendons. And when weapons broke, men used daggers, fists, or even teeth. Think about what that feels like. The man in front of you lunges forward, his spear scraping past your shield and nicking your arm. The sting of pain distracts you, your grip loosens for a moment. He pushes again, harder, and suddenly the weapon is pressing into your chest. You shove back desperately, your arms shaking from exhaustion. Behind you, another soldier shoves forward, pinning you in place. There's nowhere to go. The spear point edges closer. You swing your sword awkwardly, not in a grand arc but in a desperate jab, hoping to push him back. The blade doesn't cut cleanly, it glances off his armor, scraping along metal, sparks flying. He snarls, and you see his teeth bared through the slit of his helmet, his face twisted in rage. And then, in the blink of an eye, he falls. Someone else's weapon pierces his side, blood spraying across your face. You don't even have time to process it before another enemy takes his place. That's the nature of close combat, there's no pause, no breath, no moment to gather yourself. Kill one, and another is there instantly. It's endless. And for you, untrained, the mental and physical shock of that would be unbearable. Now picture what happens when the line breaks down further. Soldiers grapple directly. You're shoved, tripped, and suddenly you're on the ground. The mud is cold against your cheek, and before you can scramble up, someone steps on your back. You try to roll, gasping for breath, and see boots and hooves crashing down inches from your face. A dagger flashes, plunging into the throat of the man beside you. You raise your shield just in time to block a downward strike, the impact rattling your arm so hard you scream. You try to push up, but your armor is heavy, the ground is slick, and your strength is almost gone. Close combat doesn't give second chances. Once you fall, you rarely get back up. And even when you're standing, you're never safe. The chaos means blows come from every direction. An enemy behind you might swing an axe into your back before you even know he's there. A spear from the side jabs into your thigh. The shield wall that once gave you protection is gone, scattered into fragments. You're alone in a storm of steel. Your head swivels desperately, eyes darting, but there are too many threats. Every second is a gamble. Every breath could be your last. The brutality was heightened by the fact that there was no mercy. Modern wars, at least in theory, have conventions, prisoners, and some limits. On a medieval battlefield, once the melee began, there were none. If you stumbled, you were stabbed where you lay. If you begged, you were silenced with a mace to the skull. If you turned your back, you were cut down without hesitation. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy. It was to kill as many as possible, to break their will completely. Survival often depended on dehumanizing the enemy, seeing them not as people but as obstacles to be removed. For someone like you, raised in a world where killing is distant and rare, that coldness would be impossible. You'd hesitate, and hesitation meant death. Think about the weapons themselves. A dagger in close combat wasn't used with precision, it was jammed into the weak spots of armor, under the chin, through the visor, into the armpit. Soldiers carried rondel daggers specifically for this purpose, to finish enemies who had fallen. You might be standing in the crush one moment, and the next you feel a hand on your shoulder pulling you down, a blade sliding under your helmet into your neck. Quick, brutal, merciless. That's how battles were fought. And then there's the sheer exhaustion. Close combat wasn't just about strength, it was about endurance. Every thrust, every block, every shove drained your muscles. After minutes, your arms shook uncontrollably. After an hour, even trained soldiers struggled to lift their weapons. You, with no training, would last minutes at best. Your swings would grow sloppy, your shield would sag, your breath would come in desperate gasps. And that's when the enemy finished you. Not with a glorious duel, but with a simple, efficient strike to your exposed side. The sensory overload added to the nightmare. You'd hear men screaming in agony inches away. You'd smell the blood and sweat so thick it coated your throat. You'd feel the spray of warm liquid on your face when someone nearby was cut down. You'd see eyes staring at you through helmets, wide with rage or terror. You'd feel the crunch of bone under your weapon when you landed a blow, the jolt traveling up your arm. And all of it would blend into one overwhelming storm of horror. Your mind, unused to such violence, would likely shut down. Some men froze, standing still in shock until they were killed where they stood. That would almost certainly be your fate. And even if, somehow, you managed to land blows and stay alive, there was no guarantee of survival. Many soldiers died not because they were weaker, but because they were unlucky. A stray strike, a misstep, a stumble, and it was over. Survival often came down to chance, and chance rarely favored the inexperienced. The aftermath of close combat was no less brutal. When the fighting moved on, the ground was littered with bodies, some dead, some dying, some maimed beyond recognition. Soldiers walked among them, finishing off the wounded with daggers. Mercy was rare. Captives were valuable only if they were wealthy enough to ransom. For common men, there was no reason to spare them. And for you, lying in the mud with a shattered arm or pierced stomach, begging for help, the end would come quickly. A blade to the throat, a boot to the skull, silence. So when you picture yourself in medieval battle, don't think of heroics. Think of the crush of bodies, the endless noise, the exhaustion, and the mercilessness of men locked in combat with no thought of restraint. Think of being pressed so close you can't swing, only stab, your breath hot inside your helmet as you gasp for air. Think of daggers slipping through armor, maces crushing skulls, axes hacking into limbs. Think of the moment when you realize there's no escape, no mercy, no chance to survive. That's close combat on a medieval battlefield. And that's the reason why, even if you somehow survived everything else, once the lines met, your story would end. Up to this point, we've looked at the weight of armor, the crush of formations, the terror of cavalry, and the mercilessness of close combat. But medieval battlefields were not only about men clashing with swords and spears. They were also dominated by machines of destruction, massive, creaking, terrifying siege weapons that hurled death from a distance. These machines weren't elegant or precise. They were brutal, clumsy, and devastating, and their presence on the battlefield added another layer of chaos that would overwhelm you. Imagine standing on a battlefield, already exhausted from hours of fighting or waiting in formation. The noise of men shouting and weapons clashing fills the air. And then, out of nowhere, you hear a deep groan of wood, the kind of sound that comes from a massive machine under strain. It's a sound unlike the twang of bows or the clash of swords. It's heavier, deeper, unnatural. You look up, and far in the distance, you see a trebuchet release its sling. A huge stone, bigger than your head, arcs through the air, slowly at first, then faster, descending toward the ground. You know it's coming, but there's nothing you can do. The stone lands with a crash that shakes the earth. If it hits a group of men, they're pulverized instantly, crushed into the mud. Bones snap, bodies burst apart under the force. Even when the stone misses its mark, the shock of seeing earth and flesh explode into the air is enough to rattle nerves. Splinters of wood and shards of rock scatter in every direction, cutting down men who thought they were safe. Siege weapons weren't just about destruction, they were about fear. Every time one fired, you knew that death could fall anywhere, at random, without warning. Trebuchets and mangonels weren't the only dangers. Catapults hurled not just stones but also pots filled with burning pitch or oil. Imagine standing in a crowded formation when a clay jar smashes nearby, spilling liquid fire across the ground. The flames stick to armor, clothing, and skin, burning even as men scream and roll in the mud trying to put it out. The smell of burning flesh fills the air, and the sight of comrades running ablaze spreads panic. Fire was one of the most terrifying weapons on the medieval battlefield because it couldn't be blocked with a shield or stopped with armor. Once it touched you, it consumed you. Other weapons were more gruesome. Sometimes, dead animals or even human corpses were hurled over walls or into enemy camps. These weren't meant to crush, but to spread disease and break morale. Imagine watching a rotting carcass splatter across the field, the stench of decay mixing with the already foul air. Flies swarm instantly, and sickness follows in the days after. For someone like you, unfamiliar with the idea of deliberate disease warfare, the horror would be overwhelming. Ballistae, massive crossbow-like machines, fired giant bolts the size of fence posts. These bolts could skewer multiple men at once, pinning them together like insects. Standing in formation, you might see one coming too late, a blur of wood and iron tearing through the line. The impact would send men flying, shields splintering, bodies collapsing in twisted heaps. The randomness was terrifying. You could be holding your place, focused on the enemy in front of you, and then, without warning, you are struck from afar, never even knowing what hit you. Siege towers and battering rams brought their own chaos, especially in battles around castles or fortified towns. Picture a massive wooden tower, creaking as it's rolled toward walls. Arrows rain down from above, while defenders pour boiling water, oil, or even molten lead onto the soldiers below. You're at the base of the tower, shield raised, but the liquid sears through gaps in armor, scalding your skin. Men scream and writhe in agony around you, their flesh blistering instantly. The noise is unbearable. The smell is worse. You want to run, but there's nowhere to go. Your commanders shove you forward. You're not a person anymore, you're a pawn in a machine of war, and your job is simply to climb and die. And then there's the battering ram. A log thicker than a man, swung back and forth by dozens of soldiers, smashing into gates with deafening cracks. Every impact sends vibrations through the ground. You hear wood splinter, iron hinges bend, commanders shout. If you're defending, you know that once the gate falls, the enemy will pour in. If you're attacking, you're standing under constant missile fire, praying you don't get crushed by a falling rock or burning liquid before the ram does its job. For you, just the noise of the ram would be enough to shake your resolve. Every crash would rattle your bones, every splintering sound a reminder that defenses never held forever. The chaos didn't stop there. Smoke filled the air, smoke from burning pitch, from fire arrows, from the destruction of wooden fortifications. It choked lungs, blurred vision, and made breathing nearly impossible. In that haze, friend and foe blurred together. Soldiers stumbled into each other, striking blindly. Panic spread easily when visibility dropped. Imagine standing in that smoke, eyes stinging, lungs burning, hearing the clash of weapons but unable to see where to strike. For you, it would be disorienting beyond measure. You'd lose all sense of direction and probably be cut down before you even realized you were facing the wrong way. Siege weapons also caused immense psychological strain. Even when they weren't killing directly, they made men feel helpless. You can fight another soldier. You can block a sword. But you can't stop a boulder the size of a barrel falling from the sky. You can't fight fire spreading across the field. You can't block disease when rotting carcasses rain into camp. That sense of helplessness broke morale. Soldiers lost the will to fight when they knew death could strike them randomly, without warning, from machines far beyond their reach. You, unfamiliar with that level of randomness, would crumble almost immediately. And then consider the soundscape again. The creak of wooden frames, the snap of ropes, the whoosh of slings releasing, the crash of impacts, the screams of men crushed or burned, it was a relentless background noise that wore on nerves. Every time you heard the groan of a trebuchet winding back, your stomach would knot. Every crash of a boulder would make you flinch. That constant tension would exhaust you mentally long before the physical fight even reached you. There's also the sheer scale of destruction. Castles that seemed impenetrable crumbled under sustained bombardment. Towers collapsed, walls cracked, gates splintered. For soldiers inside, the ground literally fell out from under them. Imagine standing on a wall when it shakes from impact, stones loosening, dust rising, the structure trembling beneath your feet. You might cling desperately to your shield, praying the wall doesn't collapse entirely. For you, with no experience of such environments, the panic would be overwhelming. And finally, chaos itself. Medieval battles were chaotic enough, but siege weapons amplified it. Soldiers were scattered by impacts, formations broken apart. Fire spread uncontrollably, forcing men to fight not just enemies but the battlefield itself. Smoke, screams, and destruction blurred everything into a nightmare. Discipline, the only thing that gave men a chance, faltered under the strain. Units dissolved. Soldiers fled. And in the middle of it all, someone like you, untrained and terrified, would be lost. You wouldn't know where to go, whom to follow, or how to survive. The machines of war didn't just kill bodies. They broke minds. So when you imagine yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't stop at swords and shields. Picture the sky filled with boulders crashing down, walls shattering under rams, towers rolling forward under fire. Picture fire spreading through the lines, smoke choking the air, disease thrown deliberately into camp. Picture the chaos, the randomness, the sheer scale of destruction. That's what siege weapons brought to the battlefield. And that's why, even if you survived the crush of close combat or the terror of cavalry, the chaos of these machines would almost certainly finish you. If you've managed to survive the crush of formations, the storms of arrows, the terror of cavalry, and even the chaos of siege weapons, there is still one inescapable truth about the medieval battlefield: almost nobody walked away without wounds. And in the Middle Ages, getting wounded was often as good as a death sentence. Not because every cut was instantly fatal, but because medicine, as we understand it today, barely existed. Infection, disease, and crude treatments killed more men than swords ever did. For someone like you, even the smallest injury would quickly spiral into agony and, more often than not, death. Let's start with the nature of the wounds themselves. Medieval weapons didn't make clean cuts. A sword wasn't a scalpel, it hacked. When it struck flesh, it tore as much as it sliced. Wounds were jagged, uneven, full of dirt and rust from the blade. Spears and arrows pierced deep, often lodging in bone or organs, impossible to remove cleanly. Maces and war hammers didn't cut at all, they crushed. A blow to the arm might not break the skin, but it could shatter bone, leaving it bent at grotesque angles. An axe strike could lop off fingers or even entire limbs, leaving blood pouring onto the ground. And daggers were designed for finishing blows, driven into soft spots like the neck, groin, or armpit. These were not injuries you could shrug off. They were catastrophic traumas, the kind that leave you writhing on the ground, screaming, unable to move. Now imagine yourself receiving one of those wounds. An arrow pierces your thigh. The pain is blinding, sharp, every heartbeat sending another jolt of fire up your leg. You look down and see the shaft sticking out, blood pooling in your boot. You want to pull it out, but doing so could make it worse, tearing flesh and opening the artery. So you stumble, half collapse, trying to keep fighting, but your leg won't support you anymore. Within minutes you're on the ground, crawling, while the chaos rages above you. You might survive the battle, but the wound itself is a ticking clock. That's where medicine, or what passed for medicine, comes in. In the modern world, you'd be rushed to a hospital, given anesthesia, antibiotics, clean bandages. In the Middle Ages, you'd be dragged to the back lines, dumped on the ground with dozens of other groaning men, and tended to by someone with little more than knives, cloth, and herbs. Doctors, as we think of them, were rare. Most battlefield care was done by monks, barbers, or even fellow soldiers. Their tools were crude, their knowledge limited. If an arrow was lodged deep, the common solution was to push it through rather than pull it out. That meant forcing the arrowhead completely through your body until it exited on the other side, then cutting it free. Imagine the agony of that, with no anesthesia, no morphine, no numbing agents beyond maybe a sip of wine or a bite of leather to clamp between your teeth. You'd scream, you'd thrash, and even if the arrow came out, infection would almost certainly set in. If a limb was too damaged to save, amputation was the answer. Soldiers with mangled arms or legs had them hacked off with saws or axes, often right there in the field. No antiseptics, no sterilized instruments, just raw wood and iron. Assistants held the man down while the surgeon cut through flesh and sawed through bone. Hot irons cauterized the wound to stop bleeding, filling the air with the sickening smell of burning flesh. Many men died during the operation itself, their bodies unable to withstand the shock. Those who survived often died days later from infection. Gangrene set in, flesh blackening and rotting, the smell of decay spreading until death finally ended the suffering. Even minor wounds were deadly. A cut to the hand could fester. Without proper cleaning, dirt and bacteria entered easily. Redness spread, then swelling, then fever. Within a week, a man who thought he'd been lucky with just a scratch could be shivering with chills, his body racked with infection. Blood poisoning, what we now call sepsis, was a common killer. Soldiers would lie in their tents, delirious, their veins darkening under their skin, until they slipped into unconsciousness and died. Broken bones were no better. If your arm snapped from a mace strike, there were no casts, no modern surgical pins. At best, the bone might be wrapped tightly with wooden splints and left to heal crooked. At worst, it was left untreated, leaving the soldier crippled for life. A shattered leg could mean permanent lameness, the end of usefulness in battle, and often abandonment by commanders who saw no value in feeding a man who couldn't fight. Then there were head injuries. Helmets provided some protection, but not against every strike. A mace to the skull could leave a man alive but permanently damaged, unable to speak clearly or control his movements. Concussions, brain trauma, blindness from blows to the face, these were common, and there was no treatment. Men simply lived, or didn't, with the consequences. Disease also flourished in the aftermath of battle. Wounds attracted flies, maggots, and infection. Camps overflowed with filth, human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies. Lice and fleas spread fever. Dysentery swept through armies, leaving soldiers too weak to fight. Typhus, plague, and other epidemics killed more men than swords. Imagine lying wounded, thirsty and feverish, surrounded by the groans of other dying men, the air thick with the stench of rot. That was the reality of medieval hospitals. For you, used to sterile wards and clean sheets, the horror would be unimaginable. Even the treatments themselves could be worse than the wounds. Doctors used cauterization, burning wounds shut with hot irons. They applied poultices of herbs, honey, or even animal dung, believing it drew out infection. Bloodletting was common, draining bad blood from already weakened men. Superstitions often guided care, charms, prayers, or astrology determined treatment more than actual healing knowledge. To you, lying in agony, these crude methods would seem like torture. And in truth, they often were. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers knew that being wounded often meant death. The fear of injury was sometimes worse than the fear of battle itself. Many prayed for a quick death rather than a slow, painful decline from infection. Survivors carried scars that twisted limbs, ruined faces, and marked them for life. Some were left blind, crippled, or disfigured, begging in the streets because they could no longer work. Now picture yourself there. An arrow has pierced your shoulder. You're dragged to the back lines, screaming. A surgeon examines you with dirty hands, his instruments rusty. He pushes the arrow through, your body convulsing from pain. You pass out. When you wake, the wound is wrapped in filthy cloth. Days later, the pain worsens, fever grips you, and the wound oozes pus. You shiver, you hallucinate, your body weakens. You beg for water. You beg for relief. None comes. Finally, the fever consumes you, and you fade into silence, one more casualty not of swords, but of medicine's failure. That was the reality for thousands of men. The battlefield didn't end when the fighting stopped. For many, it continued for days or weeks as their bodies fought, and failed, against wounds and disease. For someone like you, with no tolerance for pain and no understanding of medieval treatments, the suffering would be unbearable. You wouldn't last. Even if you escaped the fighting alive, the wounds would finish the job. So when you imagine yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't stop at the clash of weapons. Imagine the aftermath, the groans of the wounded, the stench of infection, the crude saw cutting through bone, the hot iron pressed against flesh. Imagine the knowledge that even a scratch could kill you slowly. That's the reality of injuries and medicine in the Middle Ages. And that's another reason you wouldn't survive. Even if you could somehow withstand the weapons, the armor, the arrows, and the chaos of battle, there's a quieter killer on a medieval battlefield, one that doesn't arrive with a sword strike or a crushing blow. It's the slow, grinding toll of fatigue and hunger. Wars in the Middle Ages weren't decided in minutes. Battles could stretch for hours, and campaigns for weeks or months. And unlike in the modern world, there were no field rations carefully packed in bags, no supply chains guaranteed to keep you fed, and no rest periods scheduled for recovery. Exhaustion and starvation wore soldiers down as much as steel ever did. And for someone like you, who has never known true deprivation or constant exertion without rest, this alone would be enough to break you. Let's begin with fatigue. Imagine standing in armor for hours before the fighting even begins. Your legs ache from holding your weight steady. Your shoulders burn from gripping your spear or shield. The sun climbs higher, sweat soaking into your gambeson, trickling down your back. You shift from one foot to the other, but the relief lasts seconds. The commanders shout for the line to hold position, and so you hold, trembling, even as your body begs for rest. And that's before the first clash of weapons. When battle actually begins, the physical demands explode. Every swing of your sword, every thrust of your spear, every shove of your shield drains energy. Muscles scream for oxygen. Your heart hammers in your chest. Your breathing grows ragged, shallow, and desperate. Adrenaline pushes you for a while, but adrenaline burns fast, and when it's gone, you crash. Trained soldiers knew how to pace themselves. They struck in bursts, conserved energy, moved as a unit so they weren't wasting strength. You, untrained, would burn yourself out in minutes. The first flurry of attacks would leave you gasping, arms heavy, legs trembling. And when you slowed, the enemy would cut you down. Fatigue also came from the environment itself. Mud sucked at your boots, doubling the effort of every step. Heat trapped inside your helmet made you dizzy. Rain turned weapons slippery, forcing you to grip harder. Cold stiffened your joints, each movement slower and clumsier. Every external factor piled on top of the exhaustion already draining you. Even standing still was hard work under those conditions. Marching or fighting. Nearly impossible for long. But fatigue wasn't only physical. It was mental too. The endless noise, the constant fear, the chaos all around, it drained the mind as much as the body. Every moment demanded attention, the enemy in front, the comrade beside you, the orders shouted behind you. Every moment you had to resist panic, resist instinct, resist the urge to run. That kind of mental effort was exhausting. It wore men down just as surely as swinging a sword. By the end of the day, even if you were unscathed physically, your mind would be so drained you could hardly think. Now add hunger to the mix. Armies in the Middle Ages did not eat well. Soldiers often marched with only the food they could carry, hardtack bread, dried meat, maybe some cheese if they were lucky. Supplies were unreliable. Grain spoiled. Livestock had to be driven with the army and slaughtered along the way. Many times, soldiers ate whatever they could find, roots pulled from the ground, stolen chickens, even weeds boiled into thin soup. Water was rarely clean. More often, they drank ale or stagnant water from barrels, which carried disease. Imagine waking on the morning of a battle with nothing in your stomach but a crust of stale bread. Your body is already underfed from days of marching, your muscles thin from lack of proper nutrition. Then you're thrown into hours of grueling combat. Hunger gnaws at your belly, dizziness clouds your vision, weakness saps your arms. Even if you were brave, even if you were determined, your body simply wouldn't have the fuel to keep going. And hunger wasn't just about one day. Campaigns dragged on. Armies often marched for weeks, supplies running thin. Soldiers starved slowly, their bodies wasting away. By the time they reached the battlefield, many were already weakened, already half-dead from malnutrition. You, used to eating 3 meals a day, snacks in between, and clean water at your fingertips, would collapse long before reaching combat. Even modern athletes, with training and conditioning, rely on balanced nutrition to sustain themselves. Medieval soldiers had none of that. They fought on empty stomachs, and many didn't make it through. Fatigue and hunger also made wounds worse. A man already weak from starvation had little chance of surviving blood loss. A man already exhausted couldn't crawl to safety when injured. Infection spread faster in weakened bodies. Diseases struck harder in malnourished men. The battlefield was full of corpses not just from sword blows, but from the slow killers of hunger and exhaustion. Now imagine yourself in that position. You've been marching for days, your boots worn thin, blisters covering your feet. You've eaten almost nothing, just a bite of bread here, a swallow of sour ale there. You're already shaky, already lightheaded. Then the horns sound, and you're pushed into formation. You try to grip your spear, but your arms feel like lead. You try to lift your shield, but your shoulders burn with weakness. You stagger forward, stomach cramping, vision blurring. You haven't even reached the enemy yet, and you're ready to collapse. And when the clash comes, you have nothing left to give. One shove, one strike, and you're on the ground, too weak to rise. The mental effects of hunger were just as destructive. Starvation makes men irritable, irrational, and desperate. Discipline broke when soldiers grew too hungry. Some deserted just to search for food. Others looted villages, stealing from peasants, destroying their own side's reputation in the process. For you, the constant gnaw of hunger would cloud your judgment. Fear and panic would combine with the emptiness in your stomach until you could barely think straight. You wouldn't be a soldier. You'd be a stumbling wreck, more focused on finding a scrap of food than holding the line. And fatigue didn't end with the battle. After hours of fighting, survivors had to march again, set up camp, gather wood, dig latrines, fetch water. There was no rest, no relief. Even the night brought little comfort. Soldiers slept on hard ground, in wet clothes, surrounded by groans of the wounded and the stench of death. Rats scurried through camp, biting at exposed skin. Fleas and lice crawled in blankets. Sleep was shallow, restless, constantly interrupted by fear of ambush or hunger pains. You'd wake more tired than when you lay down. The fatigue built day after day, grinding down body and spirit until there was nothing left. And then came the next battle. You'd stand again, trembling from weakness, eyes hollow, body aching, pushed forward by commanders who cared nothing for your suffering. Hunger in your belly, exhaustion in your bones, and terror in your mind, you'd be broken before the enemy even touched you. This was the reality of medieval warfare. It wasn't just the clash of steel. It was the long, slow grind of deprivation. Men fought not just against enemies, but against their own failing bodies. For you, raised in comfort compared to them, there would be no chance. The fatigue alone would leave you gasping. The hunger alone would leave you weak. Together, they would finish you. So when you imagine yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't just think about the moment of combat. Think about the days before and after, the endless marching, the empty stomach, the restless nights. Think about your arms too weak to lift a shield, your legs trembling from exhaustion, your belly cramping with hunger. Think about how every step, every breath, every moment is a struggle, even before the enemy arrives. That's fatigue and hunger. And that's another reason why you wouldn't survive. If somehow you managed to endure the charge of cavalry, the storm of arrows, the crush of close combat, and the weight of exhaustion, you'd still face something worse than the battle itself, the aftermath. People often think the fight is the hardest part. But for those who survived, the hours and days after the clash were often more brutal, more horrific, and more unbearable than anything that happened during combat. It was here that men saw the true cost of war. It was here that the battlefield revealed its cruelty. And it was here that you, unprepared for the reality of death on such a massive scale, would finally break. The first thing you would notice is the silence, or rather, the change in noise. The constant roar of battle would end suddenly, leaving behind a strange, heavy quiet. But the quiet wasn't real. It was broken by groans, by screams, by the cries of the wounded. The battlefield didn't fall into peace. It fell into misery. The sounds of steel and shouting gave way to the sounds of suffering. Imagine standing there, trembling, ears ringing from hours of chaos, and hearing the low moans of men dying all around you. Some begged for help. Some called for their mothers. Some cried to God. Others made no sound at all, their bodies twitching silently in the mud. That chorus of agony never left survivors. For you, hearing it even once would scar you for life. Then there were the sights. A battlefield after combat wasn't just littered with bodies, it was carpeted with them. Men lay in heaps where formations had collapsed, their limbs tangled, their armor twisted, their faces frozen in expressions of terror or rage. Horses lay beside them, legs broken, belly split open, eyes staring blankly at the sky. Weapons and shields were scattered everywhere, some broken, some still clutched in stiff, bloody hands. The ground, once grass or soil, was churned into mud mixed with blood. Pools of red soaked into the earth, thick and dark, giving off the sharp, metallic smell of iron. For someone like you, used to sanitized hospitals and clean images of death, the sheer scale of carnage would be beyond comprehension. And not everyone on the ground was dead. Many were still alive, their wounds too severe to let them move. You'd see men crawling through the mud, dragging themselves by their arms because their legs were gone. You'd see men clutching their stomachs, intestines spilling between their fingers. You'd see faces half missing, jaws shattered, eyes gouged out. They reached for anyone passing, begging for help. But help rarely came. Soldiers had no time, no resources, and often no compassion left to give. The wounded were left to die slowly, alone, in agony. Then came the finishing. Soldiers moved through the field after the battle, daggers in hand, killing the wounded who couldn't be saved. A quick thrust through the throat or chest silenced the groans. It wasn't mercy in the way you might think. Sometimes it was practical, to prevent enemies from recovering later. Sometimes it was cruelty, men taking out their rage on the helpless. Sometimes it was looting, soldiers killing so they could strip armor and weapons from the body. Imagine watching this unfold, men stumbling from corpse to corpse, stabbing, rolling bodies over, cutting straps, tearing away helmets and breastplates, leaving the dead naked in the mud. You'd be frozen, horrified, unable to comprehend how human beings could treat each other that way. Looting wasn't just common, it was expected. Soldiers weren't always paid well, and plundering the dead was part of their reward. Gold rings were cut from fingers, sometimes with the finger still attached. Boots were taken from feet, cloaks from backs, even if they were soaked with blood. Armor was stripped from corpses, dented and cracked but still valuable. For nobles, the bodies might be spared for ransom, but for common men, nothing was sacred. You would see comrades you had stood beside only hours before being stripped and discarded like trash. That reality would shatter you. And then there was the smell. In the immediate aftermath, it was the smell of blood, thick and metallic, coating the air. But as the hours passed, another smell rose, the smell of death. Bodies in the sun bloated quickly, flesh swelling, skin turning colors. The stench of decay was overwhelming, gagging soldiers as they tried to march past. Flies swarmed, buzzing in clouds, laying eggs in open wounds. Maggots appeared within hours, writhing in the flesh of the fallen. For survivors, that smell lingered in their nostrils for weeks, haunting them. For you, unused to anything like it, it would drive you to nausea, maybe even madness. Survivors weren't spared horror either. Those who lived often staggered around in shock. Some laughed uncontrollably, their minds broken by what they'd seen. Others sat silently, staring blankly at nothing, unable to speak. Comrades searched the field for friends or brothers, only to find their bodies broken and mangled. Imagine kneeling beside someone you'd shared food with the day before, now lying dead in the mud, eyes staring lifelessly. Imagine trying to close their eyelids, only to realize they won't stay shut. That was the reality for medieval soldiers. And the aftermath wasn't over in a day. Sometimes, armies left the dead where they fell. The battlefield became a graveyard, bones whitening in the sun for months or years. Locals avoided the fields, fearful of disease and spirits. Farmers plowing later turned up rusted helmets and skulls. The land itself bore scars long after the men were gone. Even for the victors, there was little joy. Winning a battle meant standing among corpses, exhausted, starving, grieving comrades lost. It meant tending to the wounded, most of whom would die anyway. It meant preparing for the next march, the next fight, with no time to recover. For you, surviving one battle would feel like the end of the world. For medieval soldiers, it was just another day in a campaign that might last months or years. The psychological toll was enormous. Many veterans carried the memories of aftermaths more vividly than the battles themselves. The screams of the wounded, the faces of the dead, the smell of decay, they haunted dreams, returned in flashes during quiet moments, lived on for decades. Today we call it trauma. Back then, it was simply part of being a soldier. For you, unprepared, the aftermath would destroy you even if you escaped unharmed. You'd never sleep again without seeing those corpses. You'd never eat again without smelling blood. You'd never hear silence without also hearing the echoes of groans in your mind. So when you imagine yourself on a medieval battlefield, don't stop at the fight itself. Picture the hours after, when the noise has faded but the suffering continues. Picture walking among bodies, some dead, some still alive and begging. Picture soldiers stripping corpses, stabbing the wounded, laughing as they find treasures among the dead. Picture the ground itself transformed into a charnel house, mud turned to blood, air turned foul, silence turned into a chorus of agony. That's the aftermath of battle. And that's another reason why you wouldn't survive, not because you'd die in the fight, but because even if you lived, the aftermath would break you in ways you could never recover from. You've walked through the weight of armor, the crush of formations, the terror of cavalry, the storms of arrows, the chaos of siege weapons, the horror of injuries, the slow drain of hunger and fatigue, and finally the aftermath of battle. Each piece on its own is overwhelming, but taken together, they form a picture that's almost impossible to bear. And yet, for medieval people, this was not imagination. This was life. For them, the battlefield was a real possibility, sometimes an inevitability. For you, it is a distant nightmare. That distance is why you probably wouldn't last even a single day. Let's reflect on why. The most obvious difference is training. Medieval men who went to war were conditioned from youth to endure physical hardship. They carried water, chopped wood, tilled fields, hunted, herded animals. Their bodies hardened long before they held weapons. By the time they stood in formation, their backs and shoulders were already prepared for strain. You, in contrast, live in comfort. Chairs, beds, shoes, and climate-controlled rooms protect you. Your hands are soft. Your back aches from sitting too long, not from hauling loads. The basic resilience needed just to stand on the battlefield for hours isn't there. Then there is discipline. Medieval armies drilled men to obey without hesitation. To hold the line no matter what. To face death as part of a group rather than as an individual. Soldiers trusted that survival depended on unity. You, used to individual choice and freedom, would struggle with that. When your instincts told you to run, you'd listen. You'd falter. And in a medieval battle, hesitation didn't just doom you. It doomed everyone near you. That difference between instinct and drilled discipline is why formations held, or broke. And for you, they would break. Another key difference is tolerance for suffering. Medieval life was full of hardship long before battle. Disease, hunger, and death were daily realities. Children grew up seeing corpses, hearing screams, enduring pain without medicine. By the time a man went to war, he had already buried siblings, watched parents die, lived through famine or plague. Death was not an idea to him. It was a constant companion. You, in contrast, live in a world where death is hidden, sanitized, and delayed. Hospitals, doctors, and medicines cushion you from its raw presence. To be dropped suddenly into a medieval battlefield would be like stepping from a warm, safe room into a hurricane of horror. Your mind would not know how to process it. And then there is randomness. On a battlefield, no matter how skilled you were, death often came down to chance. An arrow out of nowhere. A horse stumbling. A wall collapsing. Even the strongest knights were cut down by unlucky blows. Modern people like to believe effort brings reward, that careful planning secures survival. Medieval battle destroyed that belief. Chance ruled everything. For you, that lack of control would be unbearable. You'd realize quickly that no matter how hard you tried, survival wasn't guaranteed. That realization alone could break your will. The environment too would defeat you. Mud, rain, cold, heat, all the things we now avoid with houses, cars, and clothing, were constant on the battlefield. You'd be soaked, frozen, blistered, burned, and exhausted before combat even began. You'd beg for a clean bed, a hot drink, a moment of silence. None would come. Soldiers endured because they had no choice, and because life had already trained them to endure hardship. You, with the comforts of the modern world, would crumble under the first taste of true deprivation. Even if you somehow survived physically, your mind would suffer. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the groans of the dying, the stench of decay, the feel of blood soaking into your clothes, would follow you forever. Veterans of medieval battles carried those memories for life. Some were hardened. Others were broken, their minds fractured. You, unprepared for trauma, would likely never recover. Sleep would be filled with nightmares. Waking hours would be haunted by flashes of memory. The battlefield would follow you home, long after your body escaped. So why does this matter? Why reflect on why you wouldn't survive a medieval battlefield? Because it shows us how much the world has changed. Today, survival isn't about holding a shield wall or bracing a spear against cavalry. It's about navigating jobs, cities, and technology. Our struggles are real, but they are different. And remembering the past reminds us of both our fragility and our fortune. Fragility, because without the training and hardening of medieval life, we are soft compared to them. Fortune, because we live in a world where we don't have to face those horrors. There's also something humbling in realizing that ordinary men and women of the Middle Ages endured things we cannot. They weren't superhuman. They weren't made of steel. They were people, flesh and blood, who cried, who feared, who suffered. But they endured anyway, because their world demanded it. That endurance is almost unimaginable for us. And in recognizing that, we see both how far we've come and how much we owe to the passage of time. For you, lying comfortably in a bed, listening to history like a story, the battlefield feels distant. But close your eyes and picture it, the mud clinging to your boots, the weight of armor crushing your shoulders, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground, the scream of a man as he falls beside you. Picture the sky dark with arrows, the crash of siege weapons, the groans of the wounded in the aftermath. Picture the exhaustion in your limbs, the emptiness in your stomach, the despair in your mind. Hold that picture. And then remind yourself, this is why you wouldn't survive. Not because you're weak, but because you live in another world. A world where survival is no longer about enduring such things. And perhaps that's the final reflection: survival today is easier, but it's also softer. If thrown into the past, most of us wouldn't last. But in the present, we are free from the horrors they knew. Free to learn, to imagine, to reflect, without having to bleed for it. So tonight, as you settle in, let that thought carry you. You don't have to stand in a muddy field under a rain of arrows. You don't have to brace against a cavalry charge. You don't have to smell the aftermath of battle or cry out in pain from wounds without medicine. You are safe, alive, and distant from that world. Let the hum of the present, your fan, your city outside, your quiet room, remind you how far you are from the battlefield. Let it lull you. Let it soothe you. And as sleep takes you, carry with you the strange comfort of knowing that history, with all its horrors, has already been endured. And you do not have to endure it. That is why you would not survive a medieval battlefield. And that is why, in truth, you never need to.